Hi, I will be discuss about the global city. Here's the objectives. First, to know the meaning and the importance of global city. To know the different what's to become a global city. And to understand the role of global city in the development of economy, politics, and culture. To discuss the different challenges that a global city is facing. To know the effect of rural communities to organization. So, the global city, also called World City or sometimes Alpha City or World Center, is a city which is a primary node in the global economic network. Cities in the globalizing world, although globalization certainly affects rural and urban area. Global forces are entered in cities. So, why study global cities? Globalization is spatial. Globalization is spatial because it occurs physical spaces. Globalization is spatial because what makes it move is the fact that it's based in places. So, furthermore, so far, much of the analysis of globalization is the process lessons to look at how ideas and interactionalisms shape modern world politics. We also examine cultural movements like K-pop and how they spread through media like the internet. What this lesson will emphasize is the globalization is spatial. This statement means two things. So, let's proceed to the spatial because it occurs in physical. Spatial because what makes it move is the fact that it's based in places. Then, the years to come, more and more people will experience globalization through cities. In 1950, only 30% of the world lived in urban areas. By 2014, the number increased to 54%. And by 2050, it is expected to reach 66%. Globalization is the reason for the increase in the number of people living in urban areas.
Sociologist Saskia Sakia popularized the term global city in the 1990s. Her criteria for what constitutes a global city were primarily economic. In her work, she initially identified three global cities, the New York, the London, and Tokyo, all of which are hubs of global finance and capitalism. For instance, of the world's top stock exchanges where investors buy and sell shares in major corporations. New York has the New York Stock Exchange, London has the Financial Times Stock Exchange, and Tokyo has the Nikkei. New York is more decentralized and multipolar urban system, Tokyo with little of cultural diversity or dynamism. London has a long history of colonial and imperial city. The amount of money traded in this market is staggering. The value of shares traded in the New York Stock Exchange, for example, is 19,300 billion, while of that of share in the Philippine Stock Exchange is only 231.3 billion. Recent commentators have expected the criteria that Sassen used to determine what constitutes a global city. Though it is not as wealthy as New York, movie-making mecca, Los Angeles can now rival the Big Apple's cultural influence. San Francisco must now factor in as another global city, because it is the home of the most powerful internet companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Finally, the growth of the Chinese economy has turned cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou into centers of trade and finance. The Chinese government reopened the Shanghai Stock Exchange in late 1990, and since then, it has grown to become the fifth large stock market in the world. Others consider some cities global simply because they are great places to live in Australia. Sydney commands the greatest proportion of capital. However, Melbourne is described as Sydney's rival global city because many magazines and lists have now referred to as it is the most livable city, a place with good public transportation, a thriving cultural scene, and a relatively easy pace of life. Defining a global city can be thus difficult. One way of solving this dilemma is to go beyond the simple dichotomy of global and non-global.
Indicators of global city. These are the attributes of global city: the economic power, economic opportunities, economic competitiveness, center of authority, political influence, and center of higher learning and culture. The first characteristics is economic power. Sasson remains correct in saying that economic power largely determines which cities are global. New York may have the largest stock market in the world, but Tokyo houses the most number of corporate headquarters company headquarters as against in New York City is closest competitors. Shanghai may have a smaller stock market compared to New York and Tokyo, but plays a critical role in the global economic supply chain ever since China has become the manufacturing center of the world. Shanghai is the world's busiest container port, moving over 33 million container units in 2013. Economic opportunities in a global city make it attractive to talents from across the world. Since the 1970s, many of the top IT programmers and engineers from Asia have moved to the San Francisco Bay Area to become some of the key figures in Silicon Valley's technology boom. London remains a preferred destination for many Filipinos with nursing degrees.
To measure the economic competitiveness of a city, the Economist Intelligence Unit has created other criteria like the market size, the purchasing power of citizens, and the potential for growth. So economic competitiveness in the context of comprehensive planning refers to examining, strengthening the ability of the region to compete effectively and prosper in the global economy. Going back to the criteria that the Economist Intelligence Unit has created, it's market size. So it is basically made up of the total number of the potential buyers of the product or the service within a given market and the total revenue that these sales may generate. So the purchasing power means how much your money can buy, its buying power. Purchasing power affects stock prices as well as general economic health. Okay, so how can economic competitiveness be improved? So competition may be increased by investing grants and subsidies and by tax incentives to encourage new product development. Keeping interest rate low is also a strategy that would encourage investment. In addition, keeping them as stable as possible would increase certainty and reduce risk. So political cities are also center of authority. Washington D.C. may not as wealthy as New York, but it is the seat of American state power. People around the world know its major landmark, and it is the White House, the Capitol Building or Congress, the Supreme Court, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument. Similarly, compared with Sydney and Melbourne, Canberra is a sleepy town and thus it's not as attractive to tourists, but as Australia's political capital, it is home to the country's top politicians, bureaucrats, and the policy advisor. So moving forward to the political influence. So the cities that house major international organizations may also be considered center of political influence. The headquarters of the United Nations is in New York, and that of European Union is in Brussels. An influential political city near the Philippines is Jakarta, which is not just the capital of the Indonesia, but also the location of the main headquarters of the Association of Southeast Asia Nation, which is ASEAN. So powerful political hubs exert influence on their own countries as well as on international affairs. The European Central Bank, which oversees the euro or the European Union's currency, it is based in Frankfurt. A decision made in that city can therefore affect the political economy of the entire continent and beyond.
We will proceed now at the last indicators of global city, which is the global cities are center of higher learning and culture. So it should have a lot of universities or prestigious schools that promotes a higher education in that city and have a K-12 program which is the standard of the world. So, for example, of this is New York City. So there is a lot of prestigious school there like New York University. And also the city has its own museums, concert halls, performing arts, venues, restaurants, sports events, and have a lot of international visitors. It's not just about the economy and education, because the global city citizen has an interest too in arts and music. So if those are not in the global cities, so it doesn't fit in that city. The global city and the poor. So these are the challenges of global cities. So global cities conjure up image of fast pace, exciting and cosmopolitan lifestyle. They can be sites of great inequality and poverty, as well as tremendous violence. Global cities create winners and losers, so there's still inequality. There is a gap between the poor and the rich country. As Richard Florida notes, ecologists have found that by concentrating their population in smaller areas, cities and metros decrease human encroachment on natural habitats. Denser settlement patterns yield energy savings, so there's still advantage if the settlement is compacted or crowded because it saves energy. For example, is the apartment. So mostly if apartment is compacted, so it's more efficient to heat and cool, unlike to the suburban houses or the subdivision houses. Moreover, in cities with extensive public transportation system, people tend to drive less and thereby cut carbon emissions. So a good example of this is New York City. So New York City has a lot of public transportations just like train transportations. So therefore it can less carbon emissions or the carbon prints. Even though that New York City is overcrowded, but still they are less polluted city because it's people there is barely using private vehicle, unlike in Los Angeles that people will prefer to use private vehicle. So in Asia, a good example of this is Singapore and Japan. We have consistently noted that economic globalization has paved the way for massive inequality. This phenomenon is very pronounced in cities, so mostly in developing countries just like Manila, Philippines, Mumbai, India, and Jakarta, Indonesia has a massive of inequality. It is common to find or see a big and beautiful buildings alongside of a massive squatter towns. As the city attracts more capital and richer residents are forced to relocate to far away but cheaper areas. This phenomenon of driving out of the poor in favor of newer, wealthier residents is called gentrification. So they are being forced to move further away from their cities. Of course, as the cities being progress, being attracts more capital, expense prices this is
In
very
continuation,
expensive.
this
So they have no
phenomenon of
choice
driving out
to
the poor in
relocate
favor
where
of
the
newer,
areas is much
wealthier
cheaper.
residents is called gentrification. So now, what is gentrification means? This is the process whereby the character of a poor urban areas is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. The process of making someone or something more refined, polite, or respectable. So there are some example of gentrification, like changes in land use, for example, from industrial and to restaurant and storefronts. Changes in the character of the neighborhood as community-run businesses are replaced by businesses catering to new residents' needs. And one thing of gentrification is a good thing. On the one hand, people argue that gentrification is good for cities because it brings a higher tax base, revitalizes previously derelict neighborhoods, improves public safety, and attracts newcomers to boost the company or the economy. In addition, once living in the public urban housing, they were forced to move farther away from city centers that offers more jobs, more government services, and better transportation due to gentrification. In France, poor Muslim migrants are forced out of Paris and have clustered around ethnic enclaves known as banlieue, and do not constitute part of the city proper. For instance, 80% of the inhabitants of the Paris metropolitan. And it is all about to bring economics of scale, develop markets, create jobs, and encourage new economic activities to flourish.
We have constantly noted that economic globalization has paved the way for massive inequality. This phenomenon is thus very pronounced in cities. Some large cities, particularly those in Scandinavia, have found ways to mitigate inequality through state-led social redistribution programs, yet many cities, particularly those in the developing countries, are sites of contradiction. In places like Mumbai, Jakarta, and Manila, it is common to find gleaming buildings alongside massive shanty towns. This duality may even be seen in rich urban cities. In the outskirts of New York and San Francisco are poor urban enclaves occupied by African Americans and immigrant families, who are often denied opportunities and a better life. In Australian cities, poor original Australians have been most acutely affected by this process. Once living in public urban housing, they were forced to move farther away from city centers that offer more jobs, more government services, and better transportation due to gentrification. In France, poor Muslim migrants are forced out of Paris and have clustered around ethnic enclaves known banlieue. In most of the world's global cities, the middle class is also thinning out. Globalization creates high income jobs that are concentrated in global cities. These high earners in turn generate demand for an unskilled labor force. Hotel cleaners, nannies, maids, waitresses, and etc. that will attend to their increasing needs. Meanwhile, many middle-income jobs in manufacturing and business process outsourcing, call centers, for example, are moving to other countries. This hollowing out of the middle class in global cities has heightened the inequality within them. In places like New York, there are high-rolling American investment bankers whose children are raised by Filipino maids. A large global city may thus be a paradise for some, but a purgatory for others. Conclusion. Global cities, as stated in this lesson, are sites and mediums of globalization. They are, therefore, material representation of cultures and ideas. There are also places that generate tremendous wealth. However, they remain sites of great inequality, where global servants serve global entrepreneurs. The question of how globalization can be made more just is partly a question of how people make their cities more just.